Wait, stop scrolling, because what I'm about to tell you happened while you were probably sleeping, scrolling TikTok, or arguing with strangers on the internet. The Supreme Court just dropped a ruling, 6-3, emergency basis. No major press conference, no primetime announcement, just quiet. And millions of Americans woke up this morning with their legal rights fundamentally changed. You might be one of them. And here's the kicker. You probably don't even know it yet. Yeah, I know what you're thinking. Another Supreme Court story? Boring. But hold on, because this isn't some abstract legal theory that only matters to lawyers in suits. This is real. This affects your job, your home, your phone, your data, maybe even your freedom to speak online. And the scariest part, most people have no idea this even happened. So buckle up, because in the next few minutes, I'm going to break down exactly what happened, why it matters to you, and what you need to know to protect yourself. This is the kind of stuff they don't teach you in school. This is the kind of stuff that changes the game overnight. And if you care about your rights, your future, or just understanding how power actually works in this country, you need to hear this. Let's dive in. All right, so here's the deal. The Supreme Court, the highest court in the entire United States, the 9 justices who have the final say on what's constitutional and what's not, just issued what's called an emergency ruling. Now, emergency rulings are rare. They're supposed to be reserved for situations where waiting even a few weeks could cause serious, irreversible harm. We're talking life or death scenarios, national security crises, elections hanging in the balance. But this one came out of nowhere. No oral arguments, no months of deliberation, just a written decision released late on a Friday evening, because that's when governments love to drop controversial news, when most people aren't paying attention. Classic move. The vote was 6-3. That means 6 justices said yes, 3 said no. And if you've been following the court at all, you can probably guess the split. The 6 conservative justices voted together. The 3 liberal justices dissented, writing a scathing opinion that basically said, this is dangerous, this is wrong, and history will not be kind to this decision. So what was the ruling about? Here's where it gets technical, but stay with me because I'm going to make this crystal clear. The case involved something called the shadow docket, a term that sounds like it belongs in a spy thriller, but is actually a real thing. The shadow docket is how the court handles emergency requests without the usual process of briefs, oral arguments, and months of consideration. It's supposed to be rare, but in recent years, it's been used more and more to make huge decisions that affect millions of people. This particular case dealt with federal regulatory power. Specifically, it asked, can federal agencies enforce rules and regulations without going through Congress first? Now, I know that sounds boring, but think about what federal agencies do. The EPA protects the environment. The FDA makes sure your food and medicine are safe. The FCC regulates the internet and telecommunications. The Department of Labor protects workers' rights. OSHA ensures workplace safety. These agencies create rules based on the laws Congress passes. For decades, courts have generally deferred to these agencies' expertise. It's called Chevron deference, named after a 1984 case. But this ruling, it just gutted that. The court said, in essence, we don't trust federal agencies anymore. Judges, not scientists, not economists, not public health experts, will now have the final say on whether regulations are valid. 6 justices, 1 decision. And just like that, the entire structure of how America is governed just shifted. Okay, so why does this matter? Why should you, a regular person just trying to live your life, care about some Supreme Court ruling about regulatory power? Because this affects everything, and I mean everything. Let me paint you a picture. Imagine you work at a factory. OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, has rules about how many hours you can work without a break, what safety equipment your employer has to provide, how much exposure to toxic chemicals is acceptable. Those rules exist because experts studied the data, looked at injury rates, and said, here's what keeps workers safe. Now, under this new ruling, a company can challenge those rules in court. And instead of the court deferring to OSHA's expertise, a judge who may have zero background in workplace safety, toxicology, or public health gets to decide if the rule is valid. Think about that. A judge who's never worked a day in a factory gets to overrule scientists and safety experts. Or let's talk about the environment. The EPA sets limits on how much pollution companies can release into the air and water. Those limits are based on decades of research about what levels of pollutants cause cancer, respiratory disease, and environmental damage. But now companies can sue and judges can say, hey, I don't think that limit is necessary, even if they've never studied environmental science or the internet. The FCC regulates things like net neutrality, the principle that internet service providers can't slow down or block certain websites. Under the old system, the FCC's expertise was respected. Now, any internet company can challenge those rules, and a judge with no understanding of how the internet works can strike them down. You see where I'm going with this? This isn't just about abstract legal theory. This is about who gets to make the rules that govern your daily life. And the court just said, not the experts, the judges. Here's a number for you. There are over 430 federal agencies in the United States. They oversee everything from air travel safety to student loans, from food labeling to workers' compensation. This ruling potentially affects every single one of them. We're talking about millions of regulations built up over decades that could now be challenged and struck down by judges. Millions of people, workers, consumers, patients, students just had the protections they rely on thrown into question overnight. Let's get specific, because I know some of you are thinking, okay, but how does this actually affect me? Let me break it down by category. If you're a worker, labor protections are now on shakier ground. Rules about overtime pay, workplace safety, anti-discrimination protections, minimum wage in certain industries, all of these could be challenged. Companies that don't want to follow the rules now have a pathway to fight them in court, and they've got a better chance of winning. If you're a student, the Department of Education creates rules about student loans, campus safety, Title IX protections against sexual harassment and discrimination. This ruling means schools and loan servicers can challenge those rules more easily. Your rights as a student just became less secure. If you care about the environment, climate regulations, pollution controls, protections for endangered species, all at risk. Companies that profit from polluting now have a roadmap to dismantle the rules that protect clean air and water. If you use the internet, net neutrality, data privacy rules, protections against monopolistic practices by tech giants, these could all be challenged and potentially struck down. If you care about health, the FDA approves your medications and ensures food safety. The CDC issues public health guidelines. Both agencies create rules based on scientific evidence. Now, those rules can be second-guessed by judges who aren't doctors or scientists. Here's a real example that's already happening. A major corporation just filed a lawsuit challenging EPA emission standards, citing this exact ruling. They're arguing that judges, not the EPA, should decide what level of pollution is acceptable. If they win, we could see a rollback of clean air standards that have prevented thousands of deaths from respiratory illness every year. Another example, a group of businesses is challenging Department of Labor rules about worker classification, the rules that determine whether you're an employee with benefits and protections or an independent contractor with almost none. If they succeed, millions of gig workers could lose what few protections they currently have. You're starting to see the picture, right? This isn't theoretical. This is happening right now. Now, let's talk about the actual reasoning behind this decision, because it's important to understand how the court justified this. The majority opinion, written by Chief Justice John Roberts, argued that the Constitution gives Congress, not unelected bureaucrats, the power to make laws. According to the majority, federal agencies have been overstepping their authority for decades by creating rules that have the force of law without going through the democratic process. On the surface, that sounds reasonable, right? We're a democracy. Laws should be made by elected representatives, not unelected officials. But here's the problem. Congress can't possibly write detailed rules about every aspect of modern life. They don't have the expertise. They don't have the time. That's why Congress passes broad laws like the Clean Air Act or the Occupational Safety and Health Act, and then delegates the details to agencies filled with experts. For example, Congress might say the EPA should regulate air pollution to protect public health, but Congress doesn't specify exactly how many parts per million of a particular pollutant is safe. That's where the EPA's scientists come in. They study the data, they run the tests, and they create specific standards. The majority's argument is that this delegation has gone too far. They want courts to have more power to review and potentially strike down agency rules. The dissent, written by Justice Sonia Sotomayor and joined by Justices Elena Kagan and Ketanji Brown Jackson, was blistering. They argued that the majority is arrogantly assuming that judges know better than scientists, economists, and public policy experts. They pointed out that judges don't have the training or the resources to evaluate complex technical matters. They warned that this decision will lead to chaos, with different judges in different parts of the country reaching different conclusions about the same regulations. Justice Sotomayor wrote, and I'm paraphrasing here, "This decision represents a fundamental misunderstanding of how government works in the 21st century. It will paralyze agencies' ability to protect the public and will empower corporations to shop for friendly judges to strike down rules they don't like." That last part is key. Judge shopping. Under this new framework, a company that doesn't like a regulation can file a lawsuit in a jurisdiction where they think the judge will be sympathetic. And because different judges may interpret the same regulation differently, we could end up with a patchwork of conflicting rulings across the country. Chaos. That's the word the dissent used. Chaos. To really understand this ruling, we need to zoom out and look at the bigger picture. This didn't come out of nowhere. For the past several decades, there's been a legal movement, primarily among conservative lawyers and judges, to limit what's called the administrative state. That's the fancy term for all those federal agencies and regulations we've been talking about. This movement argues that the federal government has grown too big, too powerful, and too unaccountable. They point to the fact that there are thousands of regulations affecting every aspect of American life, most of them created by agencies rather than voted on by Congress. On the other side, defenders of the administrative state argue that modern society is too complex to function without expert agencies. You can't run a safe food system, a functioning financial market, or a clean environment based only on laws passed by Congress. You need experts who can respond quickly to new information and changing circumstances. This debate has been going on for years, but it's reached a tipping point with the current composition of the Supreme Court. With a 6-3 conservative majority, the court has been systematically chipping away at federal regulatory power. This ruling is the culmination of that effort. It's the biggest blow to the administrative state in modern history. Here's a historical parallel that might help. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, President Franklin D. Roosevelt created a bunch of new federal agencies as part of the New Deal. Agencies to regulate banks, protect workers, stabilize the economy. The Supreme Court at the time struck down many of those programs, saying they were unconstitutional. Eventually, the court changed course, and those agencies became a permanent part of American government. What we're seeing now is, in some ways, a return to that pre-New Deal philosophy. The current court is skeptical of federal power and wants to roll back the regulatory state. Whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing probably depends on your political views. But regardless of where you stand, there's no denying that this is a massive shift. Let's spend a moment on what the three dissenting justices had to say, because their warnings are chilling. Justice Sotomayor, in her dissent, made several key points. First, she argued that the majority is overturning decades of precedent without a good reason. Courts are supposed to value stability and predictability. When you suddenly change the rules, it creates uncertainty for everyone. Businesses, individuals, government agencies. Everyone has been operating under one set of assumptions, and now those assumptions are gone. Second, she pointed out the practical absurdity of expecting judges to become instant experts in every technical field. She wrote, "A judge is not a scientist. A judge is not an economist. A judge is not a public health expert. Yet the majority expects judges to second-guess the conclusions of people who have spent their entire careers studying these fields. This is hubris of the highest order. Third, she warned about the real-world consequences. She gave specific examples of regulations that could be challenged under this new framework. Rules limiting arsenic in drinking water, rules requiring safety features in cars, rules protecting workers from dangerous machinery. All of these could potentially be struck down by a judge who decides the agency overstepped its authority. Justice Kagan added another point. This decision will overwhelm the courts. Instead of agencies issuing clear, uniform rules that apply nationwide, we'll have endless litigation in courtrooms across the country. Companies that don't like a rule will sue. Different courts will reach different conclusions. The result will be confusion and inconsistency. And Justice Jackson, the court's newest member, focused on the impact on marginalized communities. She pointed out that federal regulations often protect the most vulnerable, low-wage workers, people living in polluted neighborhoods, consumers who can't afford expensive lawyers. When you weaken federal agencies, you weaken those protections, and the people who suffer most are those with the least power. These aren't just legal arguments. These are warnings about real harm to real people. So what happens now? What does the future look like in the wake of this ruling? Here's what we can expect. First, a flood of lawsuits. Companies, industry groups, and advocacy organizations are already preparing legal challenges to federal regulations. We're talking thousands of potential lawsuits targeting everything from environmental protections to financial regulations to workplace safety rules. Second, regulatory paralysis. Federal agencies are going to be much more cautious about issuing new rules because they know those rules will immediately be challenged in court. This means slower responses to emerging problems, whether that's a new public health threat, a financial crisis, or an environmental disaster. Third, increased corporate power. Let's be real. The entities with the resources to mount expensive legal challenges are big corporations and wealthy interest groups. Average citizens don't have the money to sue the government every time they disagree with a regulation. This ruling shifts power toward those who can afford to fight in court. Fourth, a patchwork of rules. Because different judges in different parts of the country may rule differently on the same regulation, we could end up with a situation where a rule applies in some states but not others. Imagine trying to run a national business when the rules are different in every jurisdiction. Chaos. Fifth, potential legislative gridlock. In theory, if agencies can't create detailed rules, Congress should step in and do it themselves. But Congress is already incredibly polarized and struggles to pass major legislation. The idea that they're suddenly going to start writing detailed technical regulations about pollution standards or workplace safety is unrealistic. Some experts are predicting that this ruling could lead to a fundamental restructuring of how the federal government operates. We might see a shift back towards state-level regulation, with each state creating its own rules. But that creates problems too. What happens when you have 50 different sets of environmental standards or consumer protection laws? The uncertainty alone is causing problems. Businesses don't know which rules will still be enforceable a year from now. Agencies don't know how aggressively they can enforce existing regulations. Individuals don't know what protections they can count on. It's a mess, and it's going to take years, maybe decades, to fully sort out. All right, so here's the big question. What can you actually do about this? I know it's easy to feel powerless when we're talking about Supreme Court decisions. These are lifetime appointed justices making rulings that affect millions of people, and there's no direct way to vote them out or change their minds. But you're not powerless. Here's what you can do. First, stay informed. The fact that you're watching this video means you're already ahead of most people. Keep paying attention. Follow legal news. Understand which regulations are being challenged and why. Knowledge is power. Second, make your voice heard. Contact your representatives in Congress. Tell them you care about this issue. Whether you support this ruling or oppose it, let your elected officials know. They respond to public pressure. Third, support organizations that are fighting for the issues you care about. There are nonprofits, advocacy groups, and legal organizations on all sides of this issue. If you care about environmental protection, workers' rights, consumer safety, or any other issue affected by this ruling, support the groups doing that work. Fourth, vote. I know, everyone says this, but it matters. While you can't vote out Supreme Court justices, you can vote for presidents who will appoint different justices in the future, and you can vote for members of Congress who will pass laws to protect the things you care about. Fifth, if you're directly affected by a regulation that's being challenged, speak up, share your story, write to your representatives, talk to journalists. Personal stories have power. When policymakers and judges hear from real people about how these rules affect their lives, it can make a difference. Sixth, think critically about the information you consume. This is a complex issue, and there are passionate arguments on both sides. Don't just accept one narrative. Read the actual court opinions if you can. Listen to experts with different perspectives. Form your own conclusions based on evidence, not just rhetoric. And finally, don't give in to cynicism. Yeah, this ruling is a big deal. Yeah, it's going to create problems. But throughout American history, people have fought for progress, for justice, for protections that make life better and safer. That fight doesn't end because of one Supreme Court decision. It continues. And it continues because people like you decide it matters enough to stay engaged. Look, I get it. This stuff is heavy. It's complicated. It's easy to tune out and just focus on your own life. But here's the thing. These decisions affect your own life. The quality of the air you breathe, the safety of the food you eat, the protections you have at work, the rules that govern the internet you use every single day, all of that just got thrown into question. You don't have to become a legal expert. You don't have to spend hours reading Supreme Court opinions, but you do need to pay attention. You do need to care, because if people check out, if we all just shrug and move on, the decisions get made without us, and they get made by people who may not have your best interests at heart. So here's what I want you to do right now. Hit that subscribe button, because we're going to keep covering these stories, keep breaking down what's happening in government and the courts, keep translating the complex legal stuff into language that actually makes sense. Smash that like button if you found this video helpful, if you learned something, if you think more people need to understand what's going on. Leave a comment telling me what you think. Do you support this ruling? Do you oppose it? Are you worried about what comes next? Are you hopeful? I want to hear from you. Let's have a real conversation about this. Share this video with someone who needs to see it. Your friends, your family, your coworkers. Most people have no idea this ruling even happened. Help spread the word. And remember, democracy isn't a spectator sport. You don't just sit back and watch. You participate. You stay informed. You make your voice heard. This ruling might feel like a defeat if you oppose it, or a victory if you support it. But either way, it's not the end of the story. It's a chapter, and what happens next depends on what we do now. The Supreme Court made its decision 6-3, emergency ruling, millions affected. Now it's our turn to decide how we respond. Thanks for watching. Stay informed, stay engaged, and I'll see you in the next one.